Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're digging into a really interesting piece. It's an article from Popular Beethoven magazine
That's right.
titled Slavery and the Fallacy of Reparations.
Hmm.
Now, this article takes a very broad look at the history of slavery across lots of different civilizations. And then it gets into the arguments against reparations today.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering, this is Popular Beethoven magazine, not a specialized history journal.
Hmm.
So the approach is more commentary, a wider lens.
Right. So our mission here is basically to pull out the key points from this specific article, understand its main arguments, see what its perspective
Yeah,
is.
and we'll follow the article's structure. It gives this big overview of slavery, ancient times, more recent history,
Right.
drawing on the details it provides, and then we get to its specific take on reparations.
Okay, so let's start there. The article puts forward a pretty significant central argument about slavery right away. What's the main thing it's trying to say?
Well, the core idea, really, in this Popular Beethoven piece, is that slavery is fundamentally a shared human tragedy. It argues pretty strongly that no single civilization, no culture has clean hands or, moral superiority when you look across history.
No moral high ground anywhere,
Yeah,
basically.
pretty much. The article says exploiting people through forced labor is just this, well, disturbingly common thread through societies everywhere on almost every continent.
Right. It definitely paints it as widespread. And to support that, the article gives this extensive historical overview. Can you walk us through some of the examples it highlights? Different places, different times.
Sure. So the article starts way back. It points to the ancient Near East,
Hmm.
specifically Mesopotamia and Egypt, these early civilizations. They used enslaved people for farming, big building projects.
Right. The pyramids, temples.
Exactly. Texts and archaeology show people forced into servitude. Then it moves to the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And the scale there, wow, it was immense.
How immense.
Well, historians estimate, and the article cites this, that maybe 15 to 30% of the population could have been enslaved at its peak. Their whole economy, their social structure, relied heavily on it. Farms, mines, even in homes.
15 to 30%. Yeah, that really puts it in perspective. Okay, so it covers the classical world, but it moves forward in time too, right, to the Atlantic slave trade.
Oh, absolutely. The article definitely discusses the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade,
Hmm.
the system driven by European powers. It mentions the numbers, the estimated 12.5 million Africans forced onto ships to the Americas.
A truly brutal chapter.
Undeniably, a critical part of this history. But then, the article also puts a lot of emphasis on the Muslim world. It describes its history with slavery as particularly long and extensive.
Longer than the Atlantic trade.
According to the article, yes. It notes something like 1,300 years, from the 7th century up to the 20th. And the numbers it mentions are huge estimates between 11 and 14 million Africans enslaved, plus millions of Europeans and Asians over that time.
Millions of Europeans and Asians too.
That's what the article states. It specifically brings up the Ottoman Empire, a major Islamic power, practicing slavery for 6 centuries. Slaves there did all sorts of jobs, military administration, domestic work. The Janissaries, for example.
Okay, so a very long-lasting and geographically broad system there. What about the Americas? How does the article talk about slavery in perhaps a more familiar context for many of us?
Right. So when it gets to the Americas, the Popular Beethoven article outlines different forms. It talks about the exceptionally brutal plantation system in North America, particularly the southern U.S.,
Yeah.
where enslaved African people's labor under just horrific conditions was,
Yeah.
the engine of the agricultural economy.
Right.
It also looks at South America. Brazil is a key example.
Sugar plantations, mining.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Portuguese colony relied massively on African slave labor for sugar, gold, diamonds, millions brought there. But interestingly, the article also mentions slavery among some indigenous peoples in the Americas.
Oh, like,
It names groups like the Cherokee and Creek. They had systems of holding captives, often from warfare. Now, the article notes these systems varied and weren't necessarily the same as the kind of chattel slavery we see in the transatlantic system. Sometimes captives were integrated differently.
that's a really important point, that it wasn't just a Western thing imposed everywhere. And the article, you said, specifically addresses Africa's own history with slavery, beyond being victims of the transatlantic trade.
Yes, and this seems quite central to the article's overall argument. It states very clearly that slavery wasn't just brought to Africa by Europeans.
It existed there before.
That's what the article asserts. Various forms of slavery existed within Africa long before European traders showed up. It even names African kingdoms, like Ashanti and Dahomey, saying they actively participated in the trade. capturing other Africans and selling them
Selling them too.
to both European and Muslim traders, according to the article. And it also points out that internal slave trading within Africa actually continued even after the transatlantic trade was abolished. So it's presented as a much more complex picture.
Okay, so it's definitely pushing back on any simple narrative. What about Asia? Does the article give examples from there too?
It does, yeah. For Asia, it discusses China. It says slavery there goes way back, ancient times, used in farming, households, and even in really early dynasties like the Shang, in ritual human sacrifices.
Wow.
Yeah. And while it changed over China's long history, slavery remained, part of the social fabric, according to the piece. For India, it mentions the caste system.
Right, which isn't exactly slavery, but
Exactly. The article acknowledges it's not identical to chattel slavery, but points out the rigid hierarchy and forced labor aspects had similarities to servitude. And beyond caste, it says historical records show actual chattel slavery in India too, like in agriculture or with prisoners of war.
it really seems determined to show just how universal this practice was. And you mentioned it returns to the Islamic world's role, emphasizing the scale again.
It does. The popular Beethoven article really underscores that looking at the whole of history, the slave trade in the Islamic world was exceptionally long, over 1,200 years, it says again, and geographically vast.
What routes did it mention?
Trans-Saharan, Indian Ocean into Eurasia,
Mm.
bringing in millions from diverse backgrounds, not just Africans, but Europeans and Asians too. It gives this quite striking example.
Oh, yeah.
The Vikings, think of them raiding, exploring, but the article says they were also capturing and selling white Europeans from Britain, Eastern Europe, into slave markets in the Muslim world.
Vikings selling Europeans to Muslim markets.
That's the example the article uses. It really highlights how interconnected these systems were, apparently.
Oh, yeah, that's not something you hear about often. Okay, so after painting this vast, complex picture of slavery being everywhere, the article does shift focus a bit, right, towards abolition, and it credits the British.
It does. It gives quite a bit of attention to the British role in the movement to abolish the slave trade. It highlights people like William Wilberforce, his long campaign in Parliament,
Which led to.
the Slave Trade Act of 1807. That outlawed the British transatlantic slave trade. Then later, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which emancipated enslaved people in most British colonies.
So they passed laws. Did they do anything else, according to the article?
Yes, it emphasizes that the British didn't just legislate. They actively tried to suppress the trade using the Royal Navy. Their West Africa squadron intercepted slave ships. The article says they liberated over 150,000 Africans between 1807 and 1860.
So active enforcement at sea.
Right, and also diplomatic pressure.
They're using treaties.
Economic leverage, trying to get other nations to abolish their slave trades too.
Okay, so the article presents the British, despite their earlier role, as key players in ending the transatlantic trade. And this historical backdrop, this global view, leads into its main argument about reparations. How does it connect those two things?
Well, it transitions by acknowledging, the current calls for reparations, especially regarding the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
But then it argues that the history it just laid out, slavery being so widespread, practiced by so many cultures for so long, fundamentally complicates or even undermines the idea of singling out specific groups for reparations today.
Because slavery was everywhere, essentially.
That's the core contention, yes. Given this universal history, the article argues that focusing just on one instance, like the transatlantic trade, for reparations is, well, flawed. It keeps coming back to the idea Greeks, Romans, African kingdoms, Asian empires, Islamic societies, they are all involved in various forms of slavery.
So what specific problems with reparations does it raise based on that?
It talks about what it calls an accounting nightmare, like who exactly should pay and who should receive. It throws out these questions. Should modern-day Africans be liable for ancestors who sold slaves? Should descendants of Vikings pay or receive? What about Middle Eastern nations with their long history of the Islamic slave trade? The article suggests these questions show how incredibly complex, maybe impossible it is, to draw clear lines of accountability across history.
So practical logistical challenges. Does it mention anything about the motivations behind the reparations movement as it sees them?
It does. The popular Beethoven article voices a concern.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests the push for reparations, especially targeting Western nations, might be, in its view, a kind of manipulation of history for political goals.
Manipulation how?
It argues that some agendas might be trying to create guilt and self-doubt in Western societies. How? By focusing selectively on the West's role in slavery, while downplaying or ignoring the involvement of others like the Islamic world's trade or African kingdoms, or indigenous American practices.
And the article sees that selective focus as,
As historically inaccurate and potentially divisive, it mentions the influence of places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia in shaping narratives, while their own historical connections to slavery, according to the article, were often overlooked.
okay, so tying it all together, based on this global history, what's the article's final word on slavery's legacy and this idea of moral superiority?
Its conclusion is pretty firm. The legacy of slavery is a shared human tragedy, period. No single civilization, it argues, gets to claim moral superiority on this issue, and it warns that focusing only on the West distorts history and makes us miss the broader lessons from understanding slavery globally.
Right. So just to recap our deep dive into this popular Beethoven magazine article, its main point is that slavery was incredibly widespread, historically common across basically all cultures.
Yeah, a global phenomenon.
And it uses that historical breadth to challenge the case for reparations today, especially when focused just on the transatlantic trade. It highlights the huge complexities of who pays whom, and it raises concerns about historical narratives possibly being used for political purposes.
Precisely. The article really pushes for you to see slavery as this shared, though obviously horrific, human experience. And it cautions against views that, according to the article, selectively highlight one part of the story while ignoring others.
It's definitely a provocative perspective from this article. It certainly makes you think about the sheer complexity of history and how we all grapple with slavery's legacy today. Perhaps this overview gives you, the listener, some food for thought, maybe prompts you to look deeper into the history and some of the specific cultures or times mentioned in the article. It's a tough subject, but understanding its full, often uncomfortable global history seems pretty important.